Hello, and thank you all for joining us today. As you all filter in, we have a few technical details before we get started. At the end of the presentation, we will be inviting questions from our audience. If you'd like to submit a question to our presenters, you can do so during the presentation as well as afterwards by submitting them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A function and not the chat to send questions, but if you have any technical difficulties or other comments, you can use the chat to communicate with us as well. I'm now going to invite Jim Levitt to introduce our webinar today. Jim?
Good afternoon to everyone in New England, and good morning to those of you out further west, if you're in the United States or wherever you are around the world. We are very happy today to welcome Kate Sims, who is an associate professor in the economics department at Amherst College and associate in the environmental studies department. She has a remarkable history of studying both ecology as an undergraduate at Princeton and microeconomic theory and econometrics during her work earning her PhD at Harvard University. She has worked on projects focused on places around the world, in Thailand, Mexico, Nepal, and New England. And she has consulted to many, many institutions, including the World Bank. Kate is passionate about the importance of the dialogue between people who care about the environment and people who are trying to advance the economy. And I think that the topic that she's going to talk on today, assessing local economic impacts and opportunities for land protection in New England, is squarely aimed at people interested in both of those topics. So with that, Kate, welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much, Jim. Okay, does everything look good there and you can hear me? Great, well, thanks so much for this chance today to speak about our work on the local economic impacts of land protection in New England. I want to highlight that this is joint work with researchers at the Harvard Forest, the Highstead Foundation, and others in the region. And our goal is to work together to gather and analyze multiple sources of economic and ecological data across the New England region in order to better understand land protection impacts and trade-offs at the landscape scale and across the long term. And much of what I'll speak about today has actually been published in a paper in conservation biology. But as we're continuing with many aspects of this exploration, I would really look forward to your comments, particularly about what you see as the most interesting and policy relevant future research questions in our region. So thanks to the efforts of many incredible people, including those in Alpine, there have been substantial increases in land protection in New England in the last 25 years. As you can see from the graphic, between 1990 and 2015, more than 4.5 million acres of land were permanently protected by public and private actors. And in addition to being important ecologically, this creates a really great opportunity for learning because these changes provide a sort of natural experiment that lets us study the impacts of new land protection for towns and cities in the region. So I probably don't have to convince too many people on this webinar that land protection can come with clear ecological and economic benefits, including watershed protection, habitat protection, carbon sequestration, cultural heritage value, recreation and amenity value. But at the same time, there can be real costs of permanent protection, both in terms of foregone development opportunities, as well as maintenance or stewardship costs. And while the benefits of land protection are often enjoyed by many people across a region, the costs, particularly the opportunity cost of development, might be borne disproportionately by the local communities closest to that protected land. So this has led to a lot of concerns about what land protection means for local economic well-being. And what we wanted to do in this research was to try to look at the data and understand this quantitatively across the region. What is actually going on in our region? What are the net local impacts of land protection with respect to employment and other economic indicators? So to study this question, we're going to use data from towns and cities from 1990 to 2015 within the region. To fit this a little bit into the broader picture, prior work on the socioeconomic impacts of land protection has mainly considered public lands. And actually, except for negative impacts of federal restrictions on logging under the Northwest Forest Plan, a lot of this literature finds either no effects or positive economic impacts of land protection, particularly in the long run. Internationally, there are now studies covering national protected area systems in Thailand, Costa Rica, Bolivia, Indonesia, Mexico, and Nepal. And a lot of this work has also found small to moderate positive economic impacts of protected areas, though there is a lot of heterogeneity by park type and setting. For example, some of the work that we did in Mexico found that conservation through payments for ecosystem services led to more local economic gains than protected areas were able to. So studies so far in the US have been mainly about large federal protected areas in sparsely populated areas. But the future of new land protection might look quite different. It's likely to involve smaller areas with more private protection and probably to happen in more densely settled areas, which makes New England, with its mixed mosaic of public and private land, a great test case. Here, 80% of land is owned privately, and the past 25 years have really seen a mix of new public and private land protection. About 20% of land recently protected has been publicly protected by state, federal, and municipal or town agencies. 29% has been private protection, mainly by nonprofit land trusts and individual owners putting permanent legal easements on their land. And then about half of the land area protected has been in large protected timberlands or large forestry reserves, large areas of land with restrictions that are designed to maintain working forests. So our goal in this study was to do the best that we could in terms of estimating the causal impacts of land protection. So trying to understand what changes in employment or other economic indicators are actually due to changes in land protection as opposed to other factors happening at the same time. And our strategy for doing so is to use panel data. So to use observations over multiple years for the same city or town. And the point there is to take advantage of the timing to make sure that we assess changes in economic indicators after changes in protection have already happened, hopefully preventing bias from reverse causality of protection happening in response to development. We're also going to try to control for potentially important confounding factors. We want to take out things that might be associated with more land protection, but also determine economic impacts on their own. So specifically, we're going to include town level fixed effects, which would control for factors that are unique to each town, but that would be fixed over time, like the overall wealth of a town or its proximity to the coast or lake features in that town. We're going to also include regional growth trends. So we know, for instance, that the Boston metro area, the Hartford metro area grew relatively quickly over this period. And so we want to try to account for that with these growth trends. We're going to include common time factors, dummies that would take into account national recessions or expansions in those periods. And we want to control also for protected land among neighboring towns, because those might also affect the amenity values or recreation spending in each town. So the land protection data that underpins this analysis, I can take no credit for. This is the result of painstaking work by teams at Highstead and the Harvard Forest to aggregate data on ownership class and dates of establishment from public sources, as well as multiple private entities. And this map just shows that grouping of protected land into the three different types that I mentioned. On the economic side, our unit of analysis for the whole study is towns and cities. And we did that because these are the most relevant local governance unit for land use and public goods provision in our region. The outcomes that we consider are the number of people employed, the number of people in the labor force, and the unemployment rate. We also consider the number of new residential building permits, as well as population, median household income, and employment by industry. The employment data and the building permits data are available quite frequently, annually or monthly, and so we average those into 5-year periods. And then the median household income, population, employment data is only available at less frequent intervals from the decennial census and the 5-year American Community Surveys. So this map just shows the final study coverage that we're able to get. In nearly all of the region, the official census boundaries line up with the boundaries of towns and cities, but those of you who are from Maine will know that that is not always the case. And so the gray areas here show some missing data due either to areas of low population or places where there were boundary changes in the county subdivisions over time. Fortunately, we're able to capture more than 99% of the population of people in New England in the study. Okay, so putting a little academic in the academics for land protection title here, you get an estimating equation, but the main reason that I show you this is to try to emphasize the timing of our model. So what we're doing here is to use a standard panel regression model with town or city level fixed effects. Again, the data is broken up into five-year periods. So each time period T, each subscript T here represents one of those periods. And on the left, and so we're modeling economic indicators as a function of the stock of land protection that has occurred up until the prior time period. So on the left-hand side is the outcome, like the number of people employed for each town, I, in metro region C for time period T. And on the right-hand side is the percentage protected in that town by the end of the previous period. So by T minus 1 for that same town in metro region C. And then also on the right-hand side are those controls I mentioned. So town fixed effects, time trends, time period level controls, and land protection in your neighbors. So what did we find? We found that there is a positive association between protected land and employment, and more importantly, that this relationship remains positive and statistically significant even after we add all of those various controls. So this graph shows estimates with the successive addition of those control variables. And what you can see is that the estimated causal effect, or the best we can do towards getting towards a causal effect, which is circled, is much smaller than just the association. But it's still positive and statistically significant. And in terms of the coefficient, we find that a 1% change in land protection leads to a 0.03% change in employment in the next 5-year period. To try to put that into more meaningful terms, I would characterize that as small to moderate. And the reason why is to try to translate that into numbers of people. So to try to translate that elasticity into something that is easy to relate to, think about a town with about 20,000 people employed. That's about the size of number of people employed in the town of Amherst. If that town made a substantial shift in the share of land protected, say from 10% to 15% of land in that town, which is a 50% change, that would translate to an expected increase in employment of about 1.5% or 300 people. To compare that percentage change, that 1.5%, to changes we see in typical recessions and expansions, in the Great Recession, changes in employment were around 6% nationally and much higher in many cities and towns. From March to May of this year, due to the pandemic, the number of people employed in Massachusetts dropped by more than 20%. So that's why I would call this effect small to moderate in size, but certainly still meaningful. So we didn't have detailed data for each town to learn more about the mechanisms behind the effect, but existing research points to 3 channels for what can drive employment as a result of land protection. First, visitation-related spending at local businesses, driven by recreation and tourism spending on things like travel and lodging, equipment purchases or rentals, activities like snowmobiling, mountain biking, scenic travel. According to the Outdoor Industry Association, recreation in New England is estimated to provide more than 432,000 jobs and $52 billion a year in direct spending. A second main channel might be through increased amenity values, which can draw people and jobs to an area because of quality of life. There's growing evidence for amenity value as a strong driver of gains from land protection. Prior research in the region has shown that open spaces can result in a 5 to 35% increase in property sale prices and 13 to 14% greater appreciation rates than regional averages. Much of this land, even though it's permanently protected, also allows for sustainable resource use, which can bring local direct benefits through things like wood products, maple syrup production, fishing, etc. I would highlight work by Helena Murray, Paul Catanzaro, Brett Butler, and others at UMass, finding that the USDA Forest Legacy Program which protects working forests, contributed more than 2,000 jobs in 2016 to the section of the Northern Forest region that includes Northern New England. So since our estimates on employment are positive, the main implication is that the gains from these types of positive effects on employment outweigh other factors that might slow down employment, like limits on intensive resource extraction or limits on the conversion of land for commercial or residential development. So conservation is in net a positive driver of employment across the region. Considering other indicators, we also found positive and statistically significant impacts on the labor force. So that's the number of people currently seeking work. We found negative, but not currently seeking work or currently employed. We found negative, but not statistically significant impacts on the unemployment rate, which is a good thing, right? We want to have a negative impact on unemployment. And we found positive, though not statistically significant impacts on new housing permits. So housing permits are important, right? That suggests that land protection did not reduce additions to the supply of housing on average, as is often feared as a potential result of land protection. Clearly, land protection could have shifted the locations of development within towns or changed the density, but it didn't reduce overall housing supply, even within the towns that engaged in that additional land protection. We also find no statistically significant effects on town level median household income or population, though both of those coefficients are also positive. And finally, considering industry by sector, the point estimates that we found indicated that land protection led to employment decreases in resource intensive industries, so agriculture, forestry, fishing, hunting, and mining, and increases in recreation-based industries, so recreation, arts, entertainment, accommodation, and food. And that seems consistent with what we would expect as economies transition to more recreation and amenity-based livelihoods. We also wanted to break down impacts by protected area type because of the variation with public and private protection in our region. And we found that public, private, and protected timberlands all had positive estimated impacts on employment and the labor force. On the right, we show estimates of impact for each of those types according to distance away from major cities in the region, specifically cities with more than 100,000 people, so Boston, Hartford, New Haven, Worcester, et cetera. And what we see there is that private land protection seemed to have the highest impacts on employment if it was also close to major cities, whereas public land protection had more positive impacts far from major cities. And these patterns are consistent with private land protection driving more amenity-related growth, which might be easiest close to cities where there are other employment opportunities. And with public land protection driving more recreation or tourism-related growth, which could potentially be a particularly important factor for local economies in more rural areas. So I think these patterns suggest that a mix of public and private land protection is important to achieve positive impacts across a range of geographies. We really need both of those types. Okay, so we saw from this analysis that substantial new land protection in the region had, on average, net positive impacts. That seems to be good news, but there's still a lot that could be learned. First, what are the local factors that must be in place for towns to capture value from land protection? And here I want to recommend and highlight the case studies from the Highstead Foundation that have been put out by them this fall. This series includes Bethel and Grand Lake Stream, Maine, and Stamford, Connecticut, with ongoing work on East Hampton, Mass, and Derry, New Hampshire. And those case studies really delve in detail as to some of the local factors that helped towns succeed in capturing economic value. And I think two factors that maybe are in common across these cases, though it would be great to hear what folks in the network think too, are a clear link between land protection and the economy of the place as it already exists, whether that's through recreation, resource use, or amenity value, as long as the link is there between the existing use and the land protection, or the existing economy and land protection. And then second, community-based institutions that can really champion and steward conservation are a big part of success in each of these cases. We also have been working much more now on what are the equity implications of land protection in the region and what might that mean for future opportunities. As we presented this work, the most frequent comment that we got was, well, what does this mean for local tax rates? If land gets protected instead of developed, does the town then lose tax revenue that must be made up for by charging other landowners more? What about local public goods and spending on schools and other things that are important locally? So we've been working to try to put together a time series of municipal tax rates from New England towns and cities in order to study that question. And then finally, and I want to try to take the last 5 minutes or so to speak about this, we've been working more on questions about equity and access to the potential benefits from protected land. Specifically, do socially marginalized communities across the region have equal access to protected open space? And how would more of an environmental justice focus in land protection shift priorities for future land protection? So specifically, we wanted to understand whether there are disparities in access to permanently protected land for communities that face social marginalization according to factors like income, race or ethnicity, educational attainment, or English language isolation in the region. And here we think that the census tract level is the most appropriate one for analysis so that we can get as small as possible. So these maps show the distribution of census tracts by quartiles of median household income and the percent of population that self-identifies in categories other than white, non-Hispanic in the most recent American Community Survey estimates, which is what is meant here by the title percent people of color. We then use the database of protected lands to calculate the percent of protected open space inside or within 1 kilometer of each census tract, representing land that is either immediately close by in that tract or within a reasonable walking distance. And this map shows that data as a percent of land area for each census tract. Putting the two sources of information together, we do find clear patterns of disparity in the availability of nearby protected lands. So households in lower income census tracts and households in census tracts that have more people of color have less availability of nearby protected land. And the differences are pretty big. So specifically, households in census tracts in the lowest income quartile tend to have about half as much available protected open space as those in the highest income quartile. A median of 8.2% of land is protected within the 1 kilometer buffer area for low income tracts, compared with a median of 18.3% of land protected in the highest income quartile tracts. Tracts with the highest proportion of people of color have about 60% as much nearby protected open space, a median of 9.4% within 1 kilometer, compared to 16.6% within 1 kilometer for the most white areas. And these patterns, of course, are connected to the fact that most marginalized communities in the region are in urban areas where pressures for land development have been high. So there have been fewer opportunities for protection. But even if we look only within census tracts that are urban, we still see the same patterns and we still see big disparities in access to available protected land. If there's time in the discussion, I can show you those graphs as well. So if disparities exist, how might they be reduced? So we've used this data to also identify tracts that would potentially be high priority from an environmental justice perspective for land conservation. So we define those as tracts that are in the lowest quartile in terms of land protected now, so the least current availability, the lowest quartile for income, and the highest quartile for people of color. And these tracts are highlighted in the map of the region with the yellow outlines. What we're doing with this is we're working to put this information out as a web map, hopefully something that might be useful as people are considering new opportunities, either for land protection or for ecological restoration of degraded or already developed lands. Here's another set of maps for an area close to Boston. And as I show these examples of local areas, I do want to emphasize that we recognize there's a really fraught history of imposing conservation decisions from the outside in ways that can be problematic. So our hope is that you can think of these as potential priorities, but ultimately the actual priorities for land use need to be set by local communities themselves, hopefully through an inclusive and fair participatory process. Okay, finally, and this is my last analysis slide, we are also very interested in comparing prioritization based on increasing access for marginalized communities to prioritization based on ecological needs and priorities. So we've taken the land that is unprotected and undeveloped in each census tract, and we scored it according to commonly used ecological priority layers. Here are those for long-term ecological resilience and drinking water priority areas from the USDA's forest to faucets layer. Then for the tracts that have low availability of protected land and are also low income, we mapped out those ecological scores against the percent of people of color in each tract. And the point of this is to understand where those ecological prioritizations might be a win-win for environmental justice and where they might inadvertently reproduce existing inequalities. So what we find is instances of both. For example, on the left, long-term resilience is negatively correlated with people of color within those low availability and low income tracts. So prioritizing based on resilience would really leave out a lot of communities of color. It would also leave out just a lot of low income communities. You can see that there's not that many orange dots there, meaning that not that much of that land was classified in the highest quartile of resilience. On the other hand, prioritizing based on protecting clean drinking water would have much more overlap with EJ priorities. On the right-hand side, you can see a positive correlation between tracts with more people of color and higher forest to faucets priorities, as well as there are a lot of orange dots in that figure, suggesting that there's a lot of land that's in the highest quartile for drinking water priorities. And that could potentially also reduce existing inequalities in access to protected land. So we're working further on this and ways to better understand how environmental justice priorities might compare to existing conservation priorities. So just to wrap up, we think that the substantial new land protection that has occurred in New England presents a really unique opportunity to learn about land conservation impacts. We found that substantial new protection had net positive impacts on local economic indicators, providing local evidence that land protection can help to boost economies. But we also clearly need to know more about how to ensure that all cities and towns can reap the economic and social benefits from land conservation. And that is what we hope to be working more on in the future. I've provided a couple links here to the published paper and to the case studies from Highstead. At this point, I would really welcome your questions and reflections. I also hope that if there's room in the chat, people will introduce themselves and their own work, or they'll share resources that might be relevant and just take advantage of being together in this network. Thanks.
Great idea. Thank you very much, Kate. I have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. I invite all of our listeners to add questions. I agree with David Foster, who just wrote an email to all of us saying that was a terrific presentation. I agree. Let me use the moderator's priority and ask the first question, Kate, which is, how did you and your collaborators, including Jonathan Thompson at the Harvard Forest and everybody else, how did you come together to decide to do this research, which is really quite pioneering and innovative?
Thanks. That's a great question. I'm sure, as many other people have found, serendipity plays a role, but I had done somewhat similar work looking at the impacts, the economic impacts of protected areas in other places around the world. But New England is home, and I care a lot about land conservation here. And I had gone to a seminar at the Harvard Forest, and it was actually a seminar which Christoph Nolte, who's also done a lot of great recent work, was presenting. And after that, Spencer and Christoph and Jonathan and I were all able to chat together. And I realized that they had put together this wonderful database about New England and started dreaming about possibilities. And so I think that's the story.
All right. I have a quick question from Kate. I think it's Wanner is how you pronounce her last name, who says, I'd love to share this presentation with my colleagues at the Trust for Public Land. How can I do that? And the answer, I believe, and Marianne, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that we're going to post your presentation, the video of it, on the Alpine website. And I'm sure that Kate would be happy to share with people around the region if they simply emailed her
Yes.
directly. And Kate, I don't remember your email address. Can you share that with people?
Sure, it's easy. It's just ksims@amherst.edu.
With
So,
one M, KSIMS@amherst.edu.
yes. Or you can
right.
Google me. I'm not that hard to find on the Amherst College site.
True, true. Stephen Thor Johnson asks, how did you control for the possibility that areas with high amenity value attract both land protection and economic development?
Great question. So a big part of the reason for the town level fixed effects is to try to control for that. It's certainly the case that towns with wonderful natural features or that are close to the coast are going to have inherently higher amenity value. And so what that panel regression does is really just to use the changes over time within each town. So it's sort of comparing Amherst now after more land protection to Amherst in the past, to try to get at that. And what has to be true for you to believe our estimates is that there's some source of randomness in land protection across the region that isn't purely due to the underlying characteristics of a town. And I think that the people gathered here are part of the source of that randomness, because land protection in New England has happened in a very decentralized and personal way. And a lot of it happens in response to land that happens to become available as families transition through generational events. A lot of it is motivated by a few committed individuals in different places. And so as long as those committed individuals are doing things in a somewhat random fashion, it gives sort of good variation in where land protection is happening that we can use.
The questions are now starting to pile up, which is great. Keep asking the questions. We've got another 20 minutes or so we've got plenty of time. Jeremy Gabrielson asks a question. Jeremy, we can turn on your mic and allow you to ask the question yourself if you'd like. Kate, or
that's great.
Robin, can you turn on Jeremy's mic, please?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear
Go
me?
ahead, Jeremy, and ask your question.
I was just wondering about parts of New England that have experienced net job loss over the period. A lot of rural areas have. Do the similar patterns e.g. like where there's lots of conserved land, lower net loss of jobs in those rural areas, or is there? Just curious about that.
That's a great question. So the way that we looked at it doesn't necessarily make up for overall net job loss, because we were trying to isolate the portion of job change that might be due to land protection. We do, however, find that rural areas had the strongest positive employment impacts of any types of towns in the region. Rural areas were the ones that did the best in the analysis. Exurban and large urban areas also did well. And interestingly enough, small urban areas across New England were the ones where there might be some room for concern. So we did actually find some negative estimates on the economic indicators for small urban areas, which I think raises a lot of questions about why and what more could be done in those locations. Thanks, Jeremy. I hope I answered your question. Jump in if you want to follow up.
Okay. Kate Lindrus Conlon. Kate, we're going to turn on your microphone and ask you to ask your own question. Kate, you'll have to unmute. Yeah, are you there?
Hi, yes, I am. I guess my question is just as I wrote it. Sorry, I'm taking care of a toddler. I just kind of wonder about the public perception surrounding all the different ways conservation can be achieved, and if the varying kind of understandings of these different routes has any effects on policy, and what your thoughts are on that.
That's a great
question.
Yeah, Kate, could you elaborate a little bit more about what you mean about different perspectives, just so I...
Yeah, sure. So I have become increasingly aware of kind of anti-logging sentiments. And as someone who has my land in Chapter 61, I really have seen firsthand the benefits of working forests and how they conserve open spaces. And I was just wondering, you know, what you think about public perception of all these policies and how that might come out in the wash with policy and what actually gets done or doesn't get done.
That is a great question. That is a great question. I'm not totally sure that I am the most qualified person to answer that question. I mean, I can give you my personal view, but it might be helpful to think about other folks in the region that have done good work on that. There was a recent paper, I hope I get this right, by Anne Short Giannotti at BU and others, maybe some folks at the Harvard Forest were on that too, trying to think about the gradient of different types of towns across Massachusetts, and you know how people in them have different exposures to natural settings and how that can shape their perspectives and beliefs. And it seems like that's the type of understanding that we need to have to get at your question.
Okay. I have to congratulate you for juggling a toddler and asking that question. That was terrific.
Indeed.
I have now Paul Catanzaro, who may have an answer to that last question.
Paul wants to speak
as
on
well.
That last question.
Paul, do you want to, can you click on Paul and ask your question, please?
Absolutely. Hey, thanks, Kate. This is fantastic. This work is so critical because I think many of us working at the community level just keep running into this more and more, this struggle between land conservation and the local town budgets. And I don't know if it's we're hitting a critical mass of land conservation that's pushing the issue or what, but this is really a huge challenge that we all need to face in the coming years to advance, you know, our land conservation goals. So one just question I had for you was, can the analysis that you all did on the economic impacts at the New England region level be run at finer scales? In other words, a state, a watershed, or even a community, or where does it start breaking down, or your confidence in the model start, you know, sort of slipping?
Thanks, Paul. That's a great question. Before I answer that, did you want to say anything in response to Kate's question?
Oh, I think the paper you were talking about was Ann Short and I think Dave Kittredge looking at the Conservation Awareness Index. So there's a gradient moving out from Boston to the rural areas that highlights some characteristics. And then I think it's the McDonald paper from Harvard Forest that looked at cutting plans across Massachusetts and community characteristics where you start seeing cutting sort of blip off the screen, though there might be forest cover, you don't see any more harvesting. And I think road density was one of the big, you know, significant factors. So I'm sorry I don't have the specifics of those papers, but those were the two that I would look at. Yeah, great. I guess I also wanted to add that I think my personal view is that working forests should absolutely be part of the mix, and that they are a crucial source of jobs and income. And I mean, our region has been ecologically disturbed in so many ways. It seems like if we can do that right, then why would we not do that? But that's more of a personal view than
I think, and one based on wanting it to work from an economic perspective. So Paul, to your question, can the analysis be run at finer scales? So yes, of course we can run it for smaller scales, and you know, we've done that in some ways by looking at it broken down by public or private, or broken down by urban, exurban, rural. And we could certainly do that for a county or for a state. It's just that the uncertainty blows up as the smaller you get. And so you get much bigger standard errors, and there's less that you can say about whether or not you have confidence in those estimates. It's a shame. I think that when we go down to the local level, we need to employ different modes of analysis. And I think, again, that's why I highlighted the Highstead case studies, because I think at the level of an individual town, it is more of a qualitative process, looking both at the actual data, the numbers of town budgets over time, but also just thinking about who are the different actors, what could be the link to economic growth in that particular town. And those case studies highlight, for instance, that Bethel and Grand Lake Stream, Maine were able to really capitalize on the recreation and tourism economy, as well as on wood products and continued sources of income from the forest industry. But Stamford, Connecticut was totally different, right? There, the main source of value was through amenity values and drawing local businesses in through foot traffic. And so locally thinking about what exactly is that link and how to make that happen seems more productive to me than trying to run our regressions at smaller scales.
Great, thank you,
Kate, for that. I just want to compliment the particular group of people who are on this webinar today. You often hear people talk about how you can run a webinar and bring people together from all over the place and actually have a live seminar going on. It doesn't usually happen that way. It's usually a question and answer, a question and answer. But the way that you all are doing it by interacting and answering one another's questions is really rare in my experience and really fun for me as a moderator. I want to bring Mark Magini in. If Mark is still on, can you turn on your mic and ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
I hear you well.
Wonderful. So hi, I actually work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we've done some fairly large acquisitions in northern New England, northern Vermont, northern New Hampshire in particular. And we often work in those communities that maybe you missed in this because of the data being unavailable, communities with fewer than 100 people per town. And so we deal with skepticism about loss of tax revenue. And I guess in the simplest sense, I'm curious if there are materials or any type of information that you think might be compelling to present to town leaders in those sorts of areas.
So I've seen a lot of great work from two sources. One is the Trust for Public Land, and the other one is Paul's and other people's work on the cost of services at the town level. Again, I don't know if there are folks on the call that want to jump in about some of those resources, but there are tools available for more local use of essentially trying to figure out what the cost of services would be for developed and undeveloped land. And I think those might be the right types of tools.
Great.
But Mark, maybe if you follow up with an email, I can also make sure to get you some of those resources.
Let me call on Jill Rendell. She asked a great question a little while ago. Jill, are you still online with us?
I am, yes.
So can you ask your question, please?
Yeah, an ongoing issue that I have in all of the work that I'm trying to be involved with both conservation and water quality, protection of water quality and other sorts of global problems, is that we tend to focus on the present, which is obvious and easy, and we tend to base our assessment of the present on the past, which is an important place to get our information from. But the trick is to turn around and look forward, to take that information and face forward and look ahead. I've just gotten off another session called Higher Ground, which was about the impacts of climate change and the fact that we've got the higher temperatures and we've got the rising waters to contend with. And what that ultimately is going to mean in northern New England, in the area that we're working in, is in migration. We're already seeing it with COVID. I think that's sort of a sample case of what might be coming further down the line when some of these climate pressures come to bear. So the question is there a way to do that pivot, to take this information, to take this data and extrapolate it looking forward? Harvard Forest did that marvelous interactive map that I saw, I guess, about 2 years ago when it was still in beta, that showed some of the different scenarios and different ways that things might emerge as we move forward. But one thing that that map at the time didn't look at was water, and it didn't really consider climate change. And climate change is going to be the big problem for us, obviously. And I wonder how much all this conserved land will wind up having to be utilized in some new and novel way as these population pressures come to bear. Maybe not in our lifetimes, hopefully not in our lifetimes, but not that far down the road.
That's a great question, Jill. A series of profound questions there. I agree with you that the scenarios work that Harvard Forest has done is a wonderful step in that direction. And I thought that they did also look at climate-based scenarios, and specifically lots of people moving into the region as a result of climate change.
Did they? Maybe when I saw it in beta, it was still not complete. Maybe all those layers hadn't been developed.
Yeah.
Anyway.
If anybody's here that can pop the link to those into the chat, that would be great. Or again, I can follow up afterwards. I think that what we need to think about for the future is how the mix of these different impacts would change, right? So we can probably assume that amenity value of conservation land is only going to go up as we have more people in the region, as there's more pressure for housing, for places for people to live, and as we can work more remotely, as we've just seen, right? Right now, land prices have skyrocketed in northern New England because of the pandemic, right? And because of people working more remotely, and valuing those amenities in ways that we hadn't before because of increased interaction with them. So I think we could think about those kinds of shifts. I think it's harder to think about what will happen to resource-based industries in New England, and what does that mean in the future? I agree with you that maybe the past 30 years have been very unique in terms of that history, and there's been a lot of possibly one-time shifts. So thinking about how each of these things, each of the factors that promote economic growth as a result of land protection, but also thinking about the opportunity cost, how each of those would shift in the future, that's a great suggestion.
The other, I'll just put a finer point on it, and then I'll disconnect. But we tend to look at that, and we hear ourselves doing it if we think. We tend to think about it in terms of the present, in terms of how things are now. How are we going to get everybody a house like everybody has a house now? And it simply isn't tenable. It simply won't work. When in fact, somebody from Harvard Forest at that same meeting, when that beta was being displayed, said, you know, when the population of Boston hits the population size of current Beijing, which he prophesized would be within 50 years, which was a horrifying thing to contemplate. He said, everybody doesn't get 3,000 square foot and a half acre. They just don't. We'll be in Cincinnati before we can get them all put to bed. So how do we rethink the expectation for what the living experience will be in our more densely populated areas, and keep the natural world in a way that those densely congregated populations can take advantage of it? And these are the kinds of things that, and we can't help it, we're human. We think about it according to what's familiar, what we can picture, what our experience has been, but we may have to start unplugging some of those expectations.
I just want to add to that. I've heard anecdotally that the most valuable real estate in New England is that which is proximate to the Boston Common, which is right in the middle of a very densely populated part of the city that has this glorious green space right in the middle of it. So I think that 400-year-old park may offer some of the answer to your question.
Yeah, and I guess I would also just say that places that seem far away now are certainly not going to be far away in the future. And so sometimes I think we don't think we should focus on protecting things that don't seem immediately threatened. But I think your point, Jill, is that everything may eventually be very threatened. And so protect it now while we can, perhaps.
Indeed. Thank you.
Kate, we have time for 3 or 4 more questions. I'm just going to ask one on behalf of Joe Welsh because it's very concise. How can we get this information out to municipal land use agencies, planning and zoning commissions, inland wetland, and so on? I believe this could help many people understand the big picture.
Well, thanks. Again, I would offer my contact information, and we did also write, Jonathan Spencer and I wrote a piece for the conversation that's pretty easy to read, and Highstead has put out a policy brief that's pretty easy to read. So those might be good sources that I can send along too.
Kathy Orlando, are you online still? And would you like to ask your question? Okay, I don't.
Hi, hey, Jim. Sorry. Well, I was wondering if in the analysis, when you had been talking about the jobs lost, if there had been any breakdown of the types of protection, since in areas where you're using purchase of development rights programs for buying agricultural rights, one of the goals there is to really maintain and stabilize that industry and prevent the loss of those kinds of jobs. And so I wondered if there had been any analysis where you've been able to take a look at, is that in fact happening, or if that's not, if the data isn't fine enough to be able to make that kind of determination.
Yeah, thanks. That's also a great question. And so far the data isn't, one of the difficulties is that they aggregated data from so many different sources. And so the information on the type of protection is fairly limited. But perhaps there's a way to do that for a subsample. Like in Massachusetts, we are so blessed with access to great data. Maybe there's a way to look at it more specifically for our state. So thanks for that suggestion.
That would be great.
So I want to offer a little bit of access to information now, and then I think we'll thank everybody and close this out. Paul Canzero offers the information that the cost of community services, including a spreadsheet to run the analysis for your own town, and TPL's work can be found at https://masswoods.org/community conservation. masswoods.org/community conservation. And in the same spirit, Bill Labick has offered the information that all of the materials posted or discussed today will be posted at wildlandsandwoodlands.org/alpine-fall-webinar-series. www.wildlandsandwoodlands.org/alpine-fall-webinar-series. And with that, I want to remind everyone that this is our last Alpine webinar for the fall. We will resume with quite a few more presentations that are lined up for the spring of this year. We are delighted to have all of you attending this, paying such close attention to it. Kate, we owe you a debt of gratitude for a great presentation, really great. And we wish you all a happy and very importantly, healthy holiday seasons. Take care. There's light at the end of the tunnel. And with that, I'll say good afternoon. We'll see you all soon.